Now, this part of the story is pretty much all we can get out of the gospel. Now, when we go to the Proto-Evangelium of James, we get a lot more. And here we find out that Mary's parents are named Joachim and Anna. Okay, this is where we get the names. And Joachim was indeed a man who had, in his village, he had a little bit of money. He was not poor, but it was from raising of animals. And in his old age, he was dealing with one very important issue. He had no children. And within Jewish society at that time, so the very fact of him being comfortable, financially comfortable, that was a blessing. But not having children was a curse. And it got to him so much so that he decided to run off into the desert and live there and die there. You could say, other than for the dramatic exit into the desert, he was probably dealing with some form of depression. His wife kind of freaked out when she heard that he had run off into the desert. And she began to, bewail publicly her status in life. And specifically, she bewailed her widowhood. That must have made him feel pretty bad since he was still alive. And bewailed her childlessness. So, and the way that it's done in this story, it's very psychological. It actually expresses a lot of that anxiety that they would have gone through because they tried to have children and were unsuccessful. And then the society, their own friends, and even their family, they looked down on them. And then they thought that perhaps they were cursed. And curses were thought to be contagious. And so you would have even some family and friends who would avoid them. And so when you begin reading in the first 2 chapters, you get a real beautiful idea of what they're going through emotionally. And Anna finally turns to God. And she begins to pray. And it is at that time that an angel of the Lord comes and visits her. And the angel tells her, Anna, Anna, the Lord has heard your prayer, and you shall conceive, you shall bring forth, and your offspring shall be spoken of throughout the world. And Anna said, as the Lord my God lives, if I have either a male or female child, I will bring it as a gift unto the Lord my God, and it shall serve him in holy things all the days of its life. So, there you get a lot more information. Aren't you happy that there's another source, just in case you read the Gospels and you wonder, gee, they're not talking about Mary too much in here. And this is how the story begins. Now, when you read on, Mary's childhood becomes filled with a certain awareness of the presence of God. Because her parents, since they had prayed so hard, since they had gone through such emotional distress, they looked to God, and God answered their prayer. And so they raised their child with that awareness that God hears the prayers of those who are afflicted and those who are distressed. Now going back to the gospel. Now, Mary, being raised in that kind of a household, she is at this age of 13, let's say, she is already betrothed. Before the angel Gabriel came to her, according to the gospel tradition, Mary was already betrothed to Joseph. Joseph was thought, not in the gospel tradition, but in the proto-evangelium, Joseph was thought to be an older man, probably a widower. And that is a tradition that has, if you think about this and you put the stories together, this is the tradition that the church actually has continued throughout the centuries. Joseph is depicted usually a little older. And of course, because he dies early on in the gospel story, it is thought that he was probably significantly older than his spouse. And when this angel comes to Mary, there is an interesting, assessment of that whole encounter. Mary does not, as I would say, any teenager, when an angel comes to her reaction seems to be quite tame. So when you read the gospel story from Luke, Mary seems to take it in pretty nonchalantly. And one would assume, if an angel appears to you and you're a teenager, I would run. It's not an experience that one necessarily is prepared for. And the church read into that Mary was indeed being prepared by her family, by her parents, for some great ministry, some great service that she was going to perform within the context of the people of Israel. And so when the angel invites her one objection is based purely on the fact that she has not had relations with her fiancé, with Joseph. And when the angel explains just a little bit more about who this child will be, she accepts it very easily. There isn't any sort of dramatic questioning. And here begins the story of the Incarnation. Now, looking at Mary, this is where we get this image of a woman who is very quiet, who is very understated, few words, and this personality that we see a little bit of in the gospel story of the Annunciation, this begins to develop in a very quiet way. If you think about it, throughout the gospel tradition, she doesn't have that much to say, but when she says something, she says it with a quiet dignity and strength. And it was really in the Annunciation that we first saw that. And it's consistent throughout. But when we go back to the proto-evangelion of James, we get a little bit more information. Mary had been raised in the context of the temple. Her parents, after having their prayers answered, after going through the 9 months and then finally delivering the child, Anna and Joachim begin to observe little Mary. And many times I'm sure they said, there's something about Mary. Because she was doing little strange things. She was able to walk at a much earlier age than other children. She was also able to speak earlier. And she spoke many times about God in ways that her parents could not understand. Mary was eventually, in the Gospel, the Proto-Evangelion takes us to Jerusalem when Mary is about 2 years old. And her parents go to Jerusalem because, of course, they want to offer thanksgiving for having received a child after after all of their years of praying and all of their problems. And when they go to the temple, they find for Mary her purpose. She becomes one of the children of the younger virgins that is raised around the temple, and who eventually would contribute through her participation in the weaving of the curtain that was inside the Holy of Holies. That was going to be her job. And so she becomes at this point associated with the temple, and eventually there is, and we celebrate this in our church year, Mary is brought into the temple as a small child, and she is presented in the temple. Nice story, huh? True? Probably not. Judging from the way girls and women were treated in Jesus' time, she would really not have been presented in the temple, not in this way. The presentation was only for the firstborn male child. So I mean, even if you were the second boy, you weren't going to get any special treatment. So this, perhaps not. But we'll get to that later, because Mary's connection with the temple is probably what we're seeing. We're looking at a theological idea that became expressed in a feast. We don't know if she was indeed involved in the weaving of the curtain. That is possible. We really don't know who did that. We know there was a curtain in the temple in Jerusalem. And according to many of the Jewish customs that concerned especially purity, an unmarried child that did not have at any point sexual relations was considered to be the purest. So it is possible that the people of Israel ignored any child labor laws and had children weaving this curtain for the temple. That is a possibility. However, the feast, that's a little bit of conjecture that's pulled out of it. Now the story continues, and the story continues because she was one of the favorites in the temple in Jerusalem. And the high priests themselves had become concerned with her and finding her a spouse that would be appropriate for her. And one of the ways that, an appropriate spouse would be found was to look amongst the widowers. Because they would be known, they went through a certain difficulty. Their first wife was probably kind of taught them to appreciate the relationship they had. The widowers were indeed well respected because they also had means. And many times, because the widowers also had other children, they looked for a younger woman who would be able to take care of the kids, keep up with the kids. Now, I know it sounds terrible. It really does sound. There's not much you can say about the marriage between an old widower and a girl who's 13 years old. Now, remember though that the images we have of Joseph may not be as close to his actual biological age. People did not live that long at that time. So he could have been perfectly well a widower at the age of 22. So the age difference may not have been as great as it sounds when we try to kind of unwrap this whole conundrum. Now, the high priests of the temple they decided that they would invite the widowers to come to the temple, and that they would bless them and then look for signs that would reveal somehow who was to be the spouse of Mary. And these different widowers came, and Joseph had found out about this contest at the temple very late. And so he came running, as the high priests were kind of upset because they couldn't find any sign that connected Mary to one of the widowers. And Joseph had, in his haste, he had picked up a stick and was using that as he walked into the city of Jerusalem. And this walking stick, when he walked before the priest, this walking stick blossomed into a lily. Does that sound familiar? And just to make it even more interesting, and out of the lily popped a dove. Yeah, I know. They thought they could have stopped at the lily stick. That was a little bit overkill. But I think the dove is probably associated, it's a symbol associated, of course, with the price that Mary and Joseph had to offer at the temple when they brought their child Jesus to be presented in the temple. It was 2 turtle doves. So that's probably the connection there.